A chance encounter. Ethan's boots crunched against the barren, rocky terrain of the alien planet. A thick haze hung low in the air, casting an eerie greenish glow over the jagged landscape. His ship lay in ruins several miles behind him, its once pristine hull now a smoldering wreck. The crash landing had left him bruised, exhausted, and utterly stranded. The communicator on his wrist was useless. Either the atmosphere scrambled signals, or there was simply no one out there to hear his distress call. The planet felt alive in a way that made Ethan uneasy. Faint rustlings in the distance, a low hum in the wind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He adjusted the straps of his survival pack and pressed forward, eyes scanning for any sign of shelter. The sun was sinking fast, and with it came an unnatural chill that seeped through his reinforced jacket. As he rounded a jagged outcrop of stone, he spotted something strange. A flicker of light, faint but unmistakable, deep within a narrow ravine ahead. Hope surged through him. It could be another stranded traveler or even an alien settlement. Gripping the hilt of his utility blade for comfort, Ethan approached cautiously. The light flickered again, steady and deliberate, like a beacon. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. The ravine narrowed, and the glow brightened as he approached. Ethan's pulse quickened. The light wasn't random. It formed a pattern, a series of symbols etched into the stone walls, glowing faintly in shades of blue and silver. He couldn't read them, but they looked familiar, almost like. A sound behind him froze him in place. A soft scrape, as if something, or someone, had moved. Slowly, Ethan turned. At first, he saw nothing but shadows shifting in the dim light. Then, a figure emerged. Tall, cloaked, and eerily graceful, the figure moved with an almost ghost-like silence. The hood of the cloak obscured the face, but when the stranger stepped closer, the faint light illuminated unmistakably alien features. Luminous silver eyes, sharp cheekbones, and skin that shimmered faintly like polished obsidian. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. The figure paused, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Then, slowly, the stranger raised their hands and pushed back the hood. Ethan's eyes widened. It was a woman, an alien woman, with a face both fierce and hauntingly beautiful. But more than that, there was something achingly familiar about her. "You," she said, her voice low and almost trembling. "It's you." Ethan blinked, his mind racing. I'm sorry. Have we met before?" Her gaze softened, and for a brief moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossed her face. "You don't remember me, do you?" she whispered. Ethan frowned, searching his memory. Wait. It hit him like a bolt of lightning. Years ago, during a diplomatic mission to a distant star system, he had been caught in a deadly ambush. An unknown ally had saved him, risking everything to pull them from the wreckage. He never saw their face, only the shadow of a figure disappearing into the chaos. "It was you," he said, his voice barely audible. The woman nodded. "Caliph," she said softly. "That's my name. I thought I would never see you again." Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. "How did you end up here? Why? Why are you here?" Calith's expression darkened. "This planet is a graveyard for exiles," she said bitterly. "After I saved you, my people branded me a traitor. I had no choice but to run." A pang of guilt shot through Ethan. "You saved my life, and it cost you everything." Calith stepped closer, her silver eyes locking onto his. "I would do it again," she said fiercely. "But you shouldn't have come here. This planet is dangerous. If they find you, they'll kill you." "Who's they?" Ethan asked, his grip tightening on his blade. Calith glanced over her shoulder, her body tense. "The scavengers, ruthless hunters who prey on anyone unfortunate enough to end up here. And you," she hesitated. "You're like a beacon to them. Humans are rare. They'll see you as a prize." Ethan swallowed hard. his adrenaline spiking. "So what do we do?" Calith's lips curved into a grim smile. "We survive," she said, "and we start by getting you out of here alive." The light from the symbols on the wall dimmed as Calith pulled her hood back over her head. "Follow me," she said, "and stay quiet." As they slipped into the shadows of the ravine, Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange sense of destiny. He didn't know why their paths had crossed again, but one thing was certain: Calith was his only chance of surviving this hostile world. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he was determined to repay the debt he owed her, no matter the cost. The faint sounds of distant movement echoed through the ravine, a chilling reminder that they were not alone. Ethan's hand hovered near his blade as he followed Calith into the unknown, his heart pounding with both fear and a strange, growing sense of purpose. The past unveiled. Calith led Ethan through a labyrinth of jagged cliffs and narrow paths, her movements precise and deliberate. The glow of the distant symbols faded as they ventured deeper into the shadows, leaving the two cloaked in darkness. Ethan's pulse quickened with every step, his senses hyper-alert to the eerie silence around them. Despite his growing unease, he couldn't help but study Calith as she moved ahead of him. There was a weight in her posture, a tension that spoke of more than just survival. "Calith." Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice hushed. "How did you know I'd be here? Or did you?" She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. The dim light of distant stars reflected in her silver eyes, giving them an almost otherworldly glow. "I didn't," she said. "Not at first. But when I heard the crash, I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Humans don't end up here by accident." Ethan frowned, "But you recognized me immediately." Calith hesitated, her gaze shifting away. "Because I never forgot you," she said softly. "You were the first human I ever met. And the last." Her words hung heavy in the air, stirring memories Ethan had buried long ago. "That mission," he said, piecing it together. "You were the one who saved me during the ambush. I didn't see your face, but I knew it wasn't one of my own who pulled me out of that wreckage." Calith nodded. "I disobeyed direct orders to help you," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "To my people, aiding a human was treason." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. "You risked everything for me. Why?" For a moment, Calith didn't answer. Her gaze hardened, as if she were weighing whether or not to reveal something deeply personal. "Because you weren't like the others," she finally said. "You didn't come to my world to exploit it, to take what wasn't yours. You came in peace, and when the ambush happened, I couldn't just stand by and watch you die." Ethan was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always suspected that his survival during that mission wasn't sheer luck, but he never imagined someone like Calith was behind it. "And your people exiled you for that?" he asked. Calith's expression darkened. "They called me a traitor, said I had no loyalty to my own kind. I was marked," she said, pulling back her sleeve to reveal a jagged scar on her wrist. "A symbol of exile. They sent me here, to this wasteland, where outcasts are left to fend for themselves." Ethan's stomach churned with anger and regret. "You didn't deserve that." Calith shrugged, her tone bitter. "Deserving doesn't matter. Surviving does." Before Ethan could respond, Calith crouched suddenly, signaling for him to stay quiet. She pointed toward a distant ridge where faint movement stirred. Shadows shifted against the starlit horizon, their shapes humanoid but distorted. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his breath catching as the figures came into view. "Scavengers," Calith whispered, her voice barely audible. "They hunt anything they can find, alive or dead, and they're relentless." Ethan's heart pounded as he watched the scavengers move with unnatural speed, their twisted forms disappearing and reappearing as they searched the area. "What do they want?" he asked. "Anything of value," Calith said. "Supplies, technology. Us. Humans are a rarity here. They'll see you as a trophy." Ethan tightened his grip on his blade, a wave of adrenaline surging through him. "How do we stop them?" Caliph gave him a grim smile. We don't. We stay hidden. And if they find us, we run. She turned and led him down a narrow path that wound deeper into the rocky terrain. Ethan followed, his mind racing with questions. As much as he wanted to focus on the immediate threat, he couldn't shake the feeling that Caliph was holding something back, something bigger than scavengers or exile. They found temporary refuge in a small cave, its entrance concealed by an overhang of jagged rocks. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and the faint glow of bioluminescent moss provided just enough light to see. Caliph leaned against the wall, her expression weary but guarded. "Why are you really here, Caliph?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "You said you didn't know I'd be here, but you seem prepared, like you've been waiting for something." Caliph sighed, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I didn't come here by choice, Ethan, but once I was here, I learned things about this planet, about your kind, and about the promise you made." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Promise? What promise?" She looked up at him, her eyes piercing. "You don't remember, do you?" she said. "When I saved you, you swore you'd help me one day, that you'd repay the debt. I didn't think I'd ever have the chance to collect on it. But now—" Ethan's chest tightened. He had said those words in the heat of the moment, overwhelmed by gratitude and desperation. He never imagined they would come back to haunt him. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Caliph stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Help me finish what I started," she said. "Not just for me, but for the ones who still believe peace between our worlds is possible." Before Ethan could respond, a distant howl echoed through the night, sending a chill down his spine. Caliph's expression hardened. "They've found us," she said. "Get ready to run." Ethan didn't argue. Gripping his blade tightly, he prepared himself for whatever was coming, knowing that his debt to Caliph had only just begun. The threat looms. The cold air stung Ethan's face as he sprinted behind Caliph, the jagged rocks beneath his boots threatening to trip him at every step. The haunting howls of the scavengers echoed through the canyons, growing louder and closer with each passing second. Caliph moved with practiced precision, her movements swift and deliberate, as if the terrain was second nature to her. Ethan, on the other hand, struggled to keep up, his mind racing as adrenaline pumped through his veins. "This way," Caliph hissed, motioning toward a narrow crevice between two towering rock formations. She slipped through effortlessly, but Ethan hesitated, eyeing the slim passage. "Move," Caliph urged, her voice sharper now. "They're tracking your scent." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He sucked in a breath, squeezed through the crevice, and emerged into a shadowy alcove on the other side. Caliph was already crouched low, scanning the surroundings. Her alien features were sharp and focused, her glowing eyes reflecting the faint light of the distant moon. "We can't stay here long," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the danger. "They'll sweep this area soon." Ethan nodded, his breath coming in short gasps. What are these scavengers?" "They're not like any aliens I've seen before." Caliph glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "They're remnants of a failed colony, a mix of species left to fend for themselves on this planet. Over generations, they adapted or devolved, depending on how you see it. They're no longer individuals, Ethan. They're a hive. They hunt together, kill together, and when they smell fresh prey." Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Ethan's stomach churned. "Great," he muttered. "Just what I needed." Caliph's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Don't underestimate them," she warned. "They're faster than you think, and smarter too. They'll try to separate us, make us vulnerable." Ethan tightened his grip on his blade. "Then let's not give them the chance." Caliph nodded, her gaze shifting to the sky. The faint hum of distant drones filled the air, a sound Ethan hadn't noticed before, but now sent a shiver down his spine. "They're using scouts," Caliph said, her voice grim. "We need to move." Before Ethan could respond, a sharp, piercing cry rang out, a signal, loud and unmistakable. Calith's eyes widened. They'd spotted us. "Fantastic," Ethan muttered, following her as she darted toward another path. The ground beneath them sloped downward, and the terrain grew rougher. Ethan struggled to keep his footing as loose gravel shifted under his boots. Calith suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. Ethan skidded to a halt beside her, his breathing ragged. "What is it?" he whispered. She pointed ahead. In the dim light, Ethan could just make out a cluster of jagged spires jutting out of the ground like broken teeth. The area was littered with the remains of old machinery, rusted metal, shattered glass, and the skeletal frames of what might have once been vehicles or structures. "A graveyard," Calith said, her tone cautious. "It's dangerous, but it might be our best chance." "Dangerous how?" Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Calith glanced at him. "The scavengers aren't the only ones who hunt here." Ethan swallowed hard. "Of course they're not." Calith moved forward cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of a curved blade strapped to her hip. Ethan followed, his senses on high alert. The air in the graveyard was thick and heavy, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust and decay. Shadows danced across the twisted wreckage, and every creak and groan of the ancient structures set Ethan's nerves on edge. As they navigated the maze of debris, Calith slowed, her movements becoming even more deliberate. She crouched behind a large piece of machinery, motioning for Ethan to do the same. "They're close," she whispered. "Stay low. Stay quiet." Ethan nodded, gripping his blade tightly. His heart pounded as he peered over the edge of their hiding spot. In the distance, he saw them, figures moving in the shadows, their forms distorted and unnatural. The scavengers moved with an eerie grace, their bodies seemingly built for hunting. Their elongated limbs and sharp, glowing eyes sent a chill down Ethan's spine. One of the scavengers let out a low guttural growl, its head snapping in their direction. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Calith tensed beside him, her hand inching toward her blade. "They can sense fear," she murmured, so quietly he barely heard her. "Focus. Stay calm." Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to steady his breathing. The scavenger sniffed the air, its glowing eyes narrowing. Then, with a sharp, inhuman screech, it leaped forward, landing just a few meters from their position. Calith reacted instantly. She drew her blade in one fluid motion, the weapon humming with energy. "Run," she hissed to Ethan. "Now." "What about you?" he demanded, his voice low but urgent. "I'll be right behind you," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan hesitated for a split second before nodding. He turned and bolted, weaving through the wreckage as fast as he could. Behind him, he heard the clash of metal and the guttural cries of the scavenger. He glanced back just in time to see Calith deliver a precise strike, her blade cutting through the creature's twisted form with deadly efficiency. But the victory was short-lived. More scavengers were closing in, their cries filling the air. Calith shouted something, but her words were drowned out by the chaos. Ethan kept running, his mind racing as he searched for an escape. Ahead, he spotted a narrow tunnel carved into the side of a rocky hill. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it, hoping it would lead to safety, or at least buy them some time. He dove inside, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Moments later, Calith appeared, her cloak tattered but her expression fierce. "They won't stop," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to find higher ground." Ethan nodded, his determination hardening. The scavengers were relentless, but he wasn't about to give up, not on Calith, and not on himself. Whatever it took, they would survive. Together. The forgotten promise. The tunnel wound upward, twisting and turning in unpredictable directions. Ethan could barely see a few steps ahead, the faint bioluminescent moss on the walls offering just enough light to guide his way. Behind him, Caliph moved with a quiet determination, her movements fluid and deliberate. Her blade was drawn, the edges faintly glowing with a strange energy that seemed to hum in tune with her resolve. "Do you even know where this leads?" Ethan whispered, his voice echoing softly off the damp walls. Caliph didn't look at him, her focus unwavering. "No," she admitted, "but it's better than staying out there with the scavengers." Ethan nodded, though unease coiled tightly in his chest. The howls of the scavengers had grown distant, but he knew better than to think they were safe. The creatures were relentless, and their absence only meant they were regrouping, or worse, setting a trap. The tunnel eventually opened into a cavernous space, its ceiling high and arched like the inside of an ancient cathedral. Strange symbols lined the walls, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Ethan stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caliph stepped past him, her eyes scanning the symbols. Her expression was a mix of awe and something else, something closer to regret. "A relic," she said, "from a time before this planet became a graveyard." Ethan moved closer, his gaze drawn to the symbols. They were intricate and fluid, like a language that was alive. "Do you recognize them?" he asked. Caliph hesitated before nodding. "They're part of my people's history," she said, "a story passed down through generations. I never thought I'd see them here." Ethan studied her, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. "What do they say?" Caliph ran her fingers lightly over the symbols, her expression softening. "It's a warning," she said, "and a promise. It speaks of a time when the exiled and the lost would find their way home, but only if they're willing to make a great sacrifice." Ethan frowned. "A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" Caliph didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the center of the cavern, where a pedestal stood, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols. Resting on top was an artifact, a small crystalline object that pulsed faintly with a blue light. Ethan's breath hitched as he stared at it. It was beautiful and unsettling, as though it didn't belong to this world. Caliph reached for the artifact, but hesitated, her hand hovering just above it. "This is what I came here for," she said, her voice barely audible. Ethan took a step closer, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "What is it?" Caliph turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "It's the key to fulfilling the promise you made," she said. "The promise you don't remember." Ethan's brow furrowed. "You keep saying that. What promise?" Caliph sighed, the weight of her emotions evident in her posture. "Do you remember the date I saved you?" she asked. "The ambush on my world." Ethan nodded. "Of course. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Caliph's gaze softened. "When I pulled you from the wreckage, you were barely conscious. But you said something that stayed with me all these years. You swore that if I ever needed your help, you'd be there. That you'd do whatever it took to repay the debt." Ethan's stomach twisted. He did remember saying those words, though he hadn't thought much of them at the time. They were spoken in desperation, a promise made in the heat of the moment. "And this artifact," he said slowly. "It's tied to that promise." Caliph nodded. "It's a beacon," she said. "If activated, it will call for aid from the Intergalactic Alliance. But it's not just a signal, it's a test. The one who activates it must prove their worth." Ethan frowned. "What kind of test?" Caliph's expression darkened. "The kind that requires you to face your deepest fears," she said, "to confront who you truly are." Ethan's throat went dry. He looked at the artifact, its light pulsing steadily, almost as if it were alive. "And if I fail?" he asked. Caliph hesitated. "Then the signal won't reach the Alliance," she said, "and we'll be left to face the scavengers, and whatever else is out there, on our own." Ethan swallowed hard. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he couldn't ignore the determination in Caliph's eyes. She had risked everything to get this far, and now she was placing her trust in him. He stepped forward, his hand hovering over the artifact. "You believe in this, in me." he asked quietly. Caliph nodded. I wouldn't have brought you here if I didn't, she said. But this is your choice, Ethan. No one else can decide it for you. Ethan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what awaited him. But he couldn't turn back now. Not when Caliph had given up so much for him. Not when the fate of her people, and perhaps his own, hung in the balance. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the artifact. The light flared brightly, illuminating the cavern in a blinding glow. Ethan closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever came next. When he opened them, the world around him had changed. The bond rekindled. Ethan blinked against the disorienting brightness that engulfed him the moment he touched the artifact. When the light dimmed, he found himself standing in an endless expanse of shimmering mist. The air was heavy with a strange energy, and faint whispers echoed all around him, though he couldn't make out the words. Caliph, he called out, his voice sounding distant, even to his own ears. I'm here, came her voice from behind him. He turned to see her stepping through the mist, her features softer now, almost vulnerable. She seemed as bewildered as he felt, her silver eyes scanning their surroundings. This is part of the test, she said. What kind of test drops us into a place like this? Ethan asked, his unease growing. Caliph didn't answer immediately. She knelt, touching the misty ground with her fingers. This is the nexus, she said finally. A place where the mind and soul are laid bare. It pulls from your memories, your fears, your regrets. To activate the beacon, you must face them all. Ethan frowned. And what about you? Are you part of this test too? Caliph's expression darkened. I'm the one who brought you here. This is your test, Ethan, but I may have a part to play. Before he could ask what she meant, the mist around them began to shift. Shapes took form, solidifying into scenes from his past. He saw himself as a child, standing alone in the wreckage of his home after a devastating raid. The echoes of distant screams filled the air, and the acrid smell of smoke made his stomach churn. Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. This isn't real, he said, more to himself than to Caliph. It feels real, Caliph said softly, stepping beside him. Her gaze was steady, but there was an unmistakable sadness in her eyes. The Nexus doesn't just show you memories, it forces you to confront what you've buried. Ethan turned away from the haunting scene, but another memory rose before him. A mission gone wrong. He saw the faces of his fallen comrades, heard their final, desperate cries for help. Guilt stabbed at him like a blade, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. I don't need to relive this, he said sharply, his voice trembling. Caliph placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. You can't run from it, Ethan, she said. You have to face it. Only then can you move forward. He met her gaze, finding strength in her presence. She wasn't just a guide through this strange ordeal. She was a reminder of the bond they shared, a bond forged in the fires of survival and sacrifice. As the mist shifted again, a new figure emerged. This time, it wasn't a memory. It was Caliph. Not the one standing beside him, but a younger version of her, fierce and determined, pulling him from the wreckage of his ship during the ambush years ago. You swore to me that day, the younger Caliph said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. You promised to help me, to stand by me when the time came. Will you keep that promise now? Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. He had made that promise in a moment of desperation, never truly understanding the weight it carried. But now, standing here with Caliph, both the woman beside him and the memory of the one who saved him, he realized the truth. That promise wasn't just a debt to be repaid. It was a bond, a shared purpose that transcended their differences. I will, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the heavy air. I'll stand by you, Caliph, no matter what it takes. The younger Caliph nodded, her expression softening. Then prove it, she said, before dissolving into the mist. The ground beneath them trembled, and the mist began to clear, revealing a new scene. They were back in the cavern, but the artifact was glowing brighter than before, its light pulsating with energy. Calith stepped back, her gaze fixed on Ethan. "It's not over yet," she said. "The final part of the test is the hardest." Ethan approached the artifact, its light bathing him in a warm glow. He could feel its energy pulling at him, challenging him to take the next step. "What happens if I succeed?" he asked, glancing at Calith. "The beacon will activate," she said. "It will send a signal to the Alliance, calling for their aid. But it will also mark us. The scavengers, the Overlord's forces, they'll know exactly where we are." Ethan swallowed hard. "And if I fail?" Calith's expression was grim. "Then the beacon stays silent, and we'll have to find another way to survive." Ethan looked at her, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, about the bond they had forged. Calith had risked everything for him once. Now it was his turn to do the same for her. He reached out, placing his hand on the artifact. The light flared again, brighter than before, and Ethan braced himself for whatever was to come. This time, he wouldn't run. He wouldn't falter. Because for Calith, and for the promise he made, he was willing to face anything. The final stand. The artifact's light exploded outward in a wave of pure energy, illuminating the cavern in an otherworldly glow. Ethan shielded his eyes as the power surged through him, a pulse that seemed to reach into the deepest corners of his mind. When the light finally dimmed, the artifact was no longer dormant. It floated midair, spinning slowly and radiating a steady hum. Calith stepped closer, her silver eyes wide with both awe and fear. "It's active," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did it." Ethan exhaled shakily, his body trembling from the effort it had taken to connect with the artifact. But there was no time to celebrate. A distant roar echoed through the cavern, a sound that made his blood run cold. "They know," Calith said, gripping her blade tightly. "The scavengers. And worse." "What do you mean worse?" Ethan asked, his voice taut with tension. Calith glanced at him, her expression grim. "The Overlord's lieutenant. If the beacon signal reached them, they'll come to stop it before reinforcements arrive. And they won't hold back." Ethan tightened his grip on his weapon, his resolve hardening. "Then we hold them off. We can't let them destroy it." Calith nodded, her sharp features taking on a fierce determination. "Follow me. If we're going to fight, we need better ground." The two moved quickly, leaving the cavern and climbing toward a series of rocky ledges that overlooked the entrance. Calith chose a narrow choke point where the path bottlenecked, ensuring any attackers would have to funnel through a single line. Ethan crouched beside her, scanning the horizon. The faint glow of the beacon could be seen even from their vantage point, casting long, eerie shadows over the terrain. And then he saw them. The scavengers, dozens of them, their twisted forms moving with unnatural speed as they converged on their location. "They're fast," Ethan muttered, his throat tightening. "They're not the worst of it," Calith said, pointing to a larger figure looming behind the pack. The Overlord's lieutenant. The creature was massive, easily twice the size of the scavengers, its body encased in black chitinous armor that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its glowing red eyes locked onto the beacon, then shifted to Calith and Ethan. "Stay focused," Calith said, her voice steadied despite the odds. "We can't let them reach the beacon." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but Calith's calm presence was like an anchor. She had fought for him once before, risking everything to save his life. Now it was his turn to fight for her, and for the promise he had made. The scavengers struck first, swarming up the rocky path with horrifying speed. Calith moved like a blur, her blade flashing as she met them head-on. Her movements were precise and deadly, each strike felling a scavenger with lethal efficiency. Ethan covered her flank, using his blade to drive back those that slipped through her defense. The fight was chaotic and brutal, the air filled with the snarls of scavengers and the clang of weapons. Ethan's muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps, But he refused to back down. Every time a scavenger fell, two more seemed to take its place, their numbers seemingly endless. "Caliph," he shouted over the chaos, "we can't hold them forever." She didn't respond immediately, her focus entirely on the fight. But then she glanced back at him, her expression determined. "We don't need to," she said. "The beacon's signal is already transmitting. We just need to buy time." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. He shifted his position, creating a bottleneck to slow the scavenger's advance. But then the lieutenant made its move, barreling forward with terrifying speed and power. It reached the choke point in a single bound, its massive form crashing through the remaining scavengers as if they were nothing. Caliph stepped forward to meet it, her blade raised. "Go," she shouted to Ethan. "Protect the beacon. I'm not leaving you." Ethan shot back, his voice filled with defiance. The lieutenant roared, its clawed hands swiping at Caliph with brutal force. She dodged and countered, her blade slicing across its armor, but the creature barely flinched. It swung again, and this time Caliph wasn't fast enough. The blow caught her shoulder, sending her sprawling to the ground. "Caliph," Ethan yelled, rushing to her side. He raised his blade, positioning himself between her and the lieutenant. The creature loomed over him, its red eyes glowing with malice. "You're just a human," it growled, its voice deep and guttural. "You don't belong here." Ethan gritted his teeth, his hand steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Maybe not," he said, "but I'm not leaving." The lieutenant lunged, and Ethan met it head-on. The impact knocked him backward, but he managed to drive his blade into the creature's arm, forcing it to retreat momentarily. Caliph staggered to her feet, her injured arm hanging limp at her side. "Ethan," she said, her voice strained, "we have to finish this together." He nodded, the two of them standing side by side as the lieutenant prepared for another attack. The scavengers had been driven back, but the beacon still pulsed in the distance, a reminder of what they were fighting for. With a roar, the lieutenant charged, and Caliph and Ethan moved as one. Their attacks were coordinated, their movements seamless. Caliph's blade struck with precision, exploiting the cracks in the lieutenant's armor, while Ethan used his strength and determination to keep the creature off balance. Finally, Caliph saw her opening. With a fierce cry, she drove her blade into the lieutenant's chest, the energy coursing through it shattering its armor. The creature let out one final deafening roar before collapsing to the ground. Ethan collapsed beside Caliph, both of them breathing heavily. The battlefield was quiet now, the scavengers retreating into the shadows. The beacon's light pulsed steadily, its signal reaching far beyond the desolate planet. Caliph looked at Ethan, her expression softening. "You kept your promise," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Ethan met her gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "And I'd do it again," he said. Together, they stood, their bond stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they would face them together. A new beginning. The silence that followed the battle was almost deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the beacon as its light pulsed rhythmically, casting soft shadows over the rocky terrain. Ethan stood with Caliph, both leaning on each other for support, their breaths ragged but steady. The lieutenant's massive form lay crumpled at their feet, its armored shell cracked and lifeless. The scavengers had scattered, their unnatural howls fading into the distance, leaving behind a strange calm. Ethan wiped sweat and dirt from his brow, glancing toward Caliph. Her shoulder was bloodied, and her movements were stiff, but her silver eyes gleamed with determination. She looked at him and gave a small, tired smile. "We survived," she said softly, the weight of her words sinking into the stillness around them. "Barely," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. "But we did." Caliph straightened, her gaze shifting to the beacon, which now stood like a sentinel, its energy radiating across the horizon. "The signal has been sent," she said. "If the Alliance received it, they'll come. But it's not over yet. The Overlord won't let this stand. Ethan frowned, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his blade. Then we hold this position until help arrives, he said. We've come too far to let it end here. Calith studied him for a moment, her expression softening. You've changed, she said quietly. The man I met years ago. He was unsure of himself, hesitant. But now, Ethan raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Now, she smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since they reunited. Now, you're a warrior, she said. Ethan felt a flicker of pride, but it was tempered by the weight of everything they had endured. I wouldn't have made it this far without you, he said. You gave me a second chance all those years ago. I owe you everything. Calith shook her head, her gaze unwavering. You don't owe me anything, Ethan, she said. We owe each other. That's what this is about. Trust, loyalty, and standing together. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden vibration beneath their feet stopped him. The ground trembled, faintly at first, then grew stronger. The beacon's light flared briefly before stabilizing. Calith's expression turned serious, her hand tightening on her blade. What now? Ethan asked, his voice tense. Calith tilted her head, listening to the distant hum that began to fill the air. A moment later, the sky above them shimmered, and a massive ship descended, its sleek, metallic hull gleaming in the beacon's glow. Ethan's heart raced as the ship hovered above, its engines emitting a low, resonant thrum. The Alliance, Calith said, relief evident in her voice. They came. The ship's ramp extended, and a group of figures emerged, their silhouettes outlined against the ship's bright interior. They were an eclectic mix of species, humanoid, insectoid, and reptilian, all clad in armor bearing the insignia of the Intergalactic Alliance. At their head was a tall, imposing figure with glowing blue eyes and a commanding presence. Calith stepped forward, her posture firm despite her injuries. Ethan followed, his hand still resting on his blade. The leader of the group raised a hand in greeting, their voice amplified by a translator. You activated the beacon, the figure said, their tone both curious and respectful. We received your signal. What is your request? Calith glanced at Ethan, her expression resolute. I am Calith, an exile of my people, she began. This human, Ethan, helped me send the signal. We seek aid to stop the Overlord who has enslaved my kind and turned this planet into a graveyard. The leader's glowing eyes narrowed slightly, their expression unreadable. You've risked much to contact us, they said. The Overlord is a powerful enemy, and engaging him would be costly. Calith nodded, her voice steady. I know, but if we don't act now, more lives will be lost. The scavengers, the exiles, they deserve a chance to fight back. And I believe with your help, we can succeed. The leader regarded her in silence for a moment before turning to Ethan. And you, human, why did you risk your life for this? Ethan met their gaze, his voice firm. Because Calith saved me when she didn't have to. Because she believed in something bigger than herself. And because I made a promise to stand by her and fight for what's right. The leader's expression softened, and they inclined their head. Very well, they said. We will aid you, but this will not be an easy fight. Are you prepared for the cost? Ethan and Calith exchanged a glance, their shared determination unspoken but palpable. We're ready, Calith said. The leader stepped aside, motioning for them to board the ship. As they ascended the ramp, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a deep sense of purpose. The fight ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt truly prepared. As the ship's doors closed behind them, Calith turned to Ethan, her expression softer now. Thank you, she said quietly. Ethan smiled, the weight of their journey momentarily lifting. We're in this together, he said. Whatever comes next, we face it side by side. Calith nodded, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the ship's interior. Together, she echoed. And with that, their journey toward a new beginning truly began.